everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Chelsea Karth, and I'd like to take a brief moment to talk to you about the Ontario Trillium Foundation. If this is the first time you're hearing about the Ontario Trillium Foundation, there are two important things you should know. First, we are an agency of the Government of Ontario, and second, as one of Canada's leading grant-making foundations, we fund over $100 million to support projects and communities across Ontario every year. The mandate of the foundation is to build healthy and vibrant communities across Ontario, and we use our action areas to define what we mean by that. They are a vision and what we aspire to achieve. On the screen, you will see those 6 action areas. They are active people with the goal of fostering more active lifestyles, connected people, which is aimed at building inclusive and engaged communities, green people, which is all about encouraging communities to support a healthy and sustainable environment, inspired people with the goal of enriching lives through arts, culture, and heritage, promising young people aims to support the positive development of children and youth, particularly those that are facing barriers, and finally, prosperous people that looks to enhance Ontario's economic well-being, moving people from crisis to economic opportunity. We believe if we can make measurable impact in those 6 areas, we will be able to achieve our foundation's mandate. Following today's webinar, if you have any interest in learning more about the Ontario Trillium Foundation and its funding streams, you can visit our website, www.otf.ca, or you can connect with our support center directly using the phone number or email on the screen. We hope that you find today's webinar helpful to your work.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chelsea, for that information. It's my pleasure today to introduce your webinar speaker, Lindsay Sage. Lindsay is co-founder and senior strategist at Sagecomm. Sagecomm specializes in brand, product, and issue positioning for brands and causes across North America. Lindsay's passions are strategy and storytelling, and her day-to-day work focuses on the facilitation of strategic plans, solutions, and stories that build powerful, authentic brands. Lindsay takes great pride in Sagecomm's long-term client relationships and community partnerships. She's energized by helping clients create powerful narratives to build connections to audiences and communities in new and remarkable ways. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thanks very much, Duncan. I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon and to be discussing the source of my passion, which is communications and strategy. I'll start by saying that overnight, my family welcomed a new family member in the form of a niece for me. My brother had a daughter, and I found myself waking up this morning feeling really grateful for the type of work that many of you who are listening do, the kind of work that builds our communities, builds the prosperity, builds inclusiveness, builds opportunity, and in particular focuses on strengthening our province and our country for the next generation, because that's where my little niece is going to benefit from all that hard work. So I find myself wanting to open by thanking you for the awesome work that you do. So hopefully you'll take away some value from what I'm going to talk about today in terms of the impact that you're trying to make in the community for the brands and the causes that you represent. So I am here to talk about sort of communications strategy 101. There's a number of different things that are bound up in this particular topic. So I do want to talk about the modern context we're operating in, just a little bit of perspective for, how things are currently in the modern age and why they are that way. I want to talk about 7 principles of great communication. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about actually preparing to plan. So when we first started discussing this series, we talked a lot with the Tamarack staff about, actually there's a lot of steps that go into getting ready to make a great plan. And I'm going to focus on some of those today. And then in a couple of weeks, I'll be focusing on the actual planning process itself. So this is what I aim to do in sort of the next 35 to 40 minutes. And I do have a lot of slides, so I'll get through the content at a fairly brisk pace, and we'll hopefully have a lot of time for questions at the end. All right, here we go. So the modern context. So, I don't have to tell you that the world around us is changing. It appears to be changing almost daily. Technology and our global interconnectedness are making things both, some things more easy to achieve and some things a lot more complex and challenging. And that's where communications is all the more important. So the work that you do as communicators and as leaders in your organization will really help to inform what people ultimately believe about the cause or brand you're representing, but then also how they act in relation to it. So you see this little bit of a fun slide here. This is a little bit of an encapsulation of the kind of environment that we're operating in terms of our ability as humans to communicate with each other absolutely second by second in real time, even in times when it's maybe not as appropriate to communicate in that moment. We have unstoppable movements that we are experiencing as a population, as human beings, which are incredibly powerful. And certainly Me Too is just one of the examples of that. We're also experiencing the rise of fake news in whatever way you choose to define fake news. But there's an awful lot out there, and certainly more and more day by day and week by week as we learn more about things like Cambridge Analytica, for example. We're learning about how misinformation in the modern age is just as potentially powerful as really good communication. So it just contributes to the need for great communication and the priority for that, but also the competition that's out there. And it's not just competition in facts and reality, but it's competition in noise that may be also quite inaccurate or misleading. And so what's causing all of this? Well, obviously there are a number of factors that contribute to these things, but there's a fairly significant one, which is our global interconnectedness. So in the year 2000, there were 361 million internet users. So this morning, or approximately around there, now we have 3.8 billion. So while the many people in the world still have not made a telephone call, we are still more connected to each other, growing day by day, minute by minute. So if you had to make a case for the importance of communications in your organization, this would be an excellent foundation for that. The imperative to communicate well has never been more important. So that's 1,000% or more growth globally over that time period. And some of you may be familiar with this quote. If you like Clay Shirky, like I do, he has this great quote that actually encapsulates the modern age. It's our misfortune, or possibly fortune, depending on how you determine it, to live through the largest increase in expressive capability in the history of the human race. That is literally, we are in the middle of a revolution. We don't always see it that way, because when you're in the middle of a revolution, you don't always recognize it necessarily. But that really is the context in which we're living. And I believe Clay Shirky said this around 2010. So even when he spoke these words, he couldn't have even forecast the amount of increase in this expressive capability that has happened even still in the last 8 years. So, but the bottom line to all of this is we are communicating more. We are not necessarily communicating well or better with one another. The volume has increased. The question is whether or not the quality has increased. And that's really what I want to focus on today. How do we communicate in a quality way to cut through all of that noise? Because at the same time as we're all communicating with each other more, our conventional media and our conventional channels are quite literally dying. So this study tells us in between 1950 and 2015, this is the stat. So in 1950, there were 102 newspapers per 100 households sold, and projected coming up now in beyond our 2020, even in 2015, there were 18. We're down to 2 newspapers sold per 100 households in Canada now. Part of that is that there are less outlets because they are resource constrained, and we see, unfortunately, our community papers in particular going out of business left, right, and center, but also that we can get our news elsewhere. Whether or not that news is accurate is irrelevant, unfortunately, currently, but other sources exist. So the days of the traditional media being able to deliver an understanding of the complex issues that some of you work on, whether we're talking about addiction or poverty or homelessness, or even things like community recreation and health, childcare, these types of things, we can't rely on traditional media anymore to tell that story on our behalf because they just aren't there. So organizations like yours need to be able to deliver those messages themselves, or together with partners like our company to help you deliver the message when the medium is changing pretty dramatically. So this leads us into the discussion of sort of 7 principles of communication. I'm going to go over them, as I said, fairly rapidly, and we can discuss any of them that anyone wants to in more detail during the question period. But what I've done is we'll talk about the principle, and then I'm also going to show you a sample of work that we've worked on at Sagecomm that we think stewards this particular principle well, just to illustrate what this looks like visually, so you can picture it. So number 1 is develop a high concept. Okay, so what do I mean, or a high position, a core position? What do I mean by this? So convey your position or your concept in 20 words or less. So there's probably some of you on the phone right now thinking that's impossible, right? We work on incredibly complex issues, and we couldn't possibly figure out how we would convey that in 20 words. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe it's 40, maybe it's 50 words. But in order to communicate well, you've got to be able to distill your position down to something that is highly digestible by your audience. So if you think it can be done, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of how they do it in Hollywood. So before any movie is greenlit to be produced, they actually have to develop a high concept and pitch said thing to get resources and funding and those types of things. So I'm going to show you a description or a high concept of a movie. And if we were live, I'd be asking you to call out what you think these things are, but I think they're fairly self-explanatory when you see. So the romantic tale of a rich girl and a poor boy who meet on the ill-fated voyage of the unsinkable ship. So high concept for Titanic, of course. And looks, next one, a selfish man seeking his inheritance discovers his autistic savant brother and abducts him on a cross-country road trip. So for those of you who enjoy this movie, Rain Man, it's a wonderful classic for anyone who hasn't seen it. Our next high concept, in 1930s Austria, a woman leaves a convent to become a governess to a naval officer, a widower with 7 children, which of course is the iconic Sound of Music, which is one of my favorite shows, and I subject my family to watching it every holiday season, whether they want to or not. So the point of saying all of this is the notion of a high concept can actually work in your sector too, no matter how complex your issue is. I'll show you a couple of examples of that. So these are some issue positions that we've worked on behalf of clients across Canada. The best place for them to be when they're not with you. High concept for a child care offering in the nonprofit environment. Every child is born with potential. Achieving that potential starts with words. That's a high concept position for a literacy campaign. And then you don't want to be left out, and neither does anyone else. That's the core concept at the heart of a poverty awareness campaign that we have developed in the last few years. So again, it's not exactly the same, but you can see where when you spend the time peeling away the layers, you can deliver a high concept that is highly relevant and really gets to the heart of what you're trying to achieve and what you want your audience to believe. Number 2, so high concept number 1. Number 2, lead with your point. So here's an example of an ad that we created for a poverty campaign here in London, Ontario. Londoners living in poverty could fill every seat in Budweiser Gardens ×7. So this is our stadium where we go to see everyone from the London Knights to Pearl Jam play concerts. It's about just under 10,000 seats. So in order to translate this issue in a context that people can understand, this is the headline we gave them. We led with our point. This is an enormous problem in our community, but we contextualize it in a way that the audience could understand. So David Ogilvy is famous for saying, and he's the old school ad man, sort of the concept of madmen was probably based on him. After the headline, you've spent 80 cents of your dollar. Right? So if we think about that, lead with your point, because after that, it's diminishing returns. Everybody reads the headline. Some people read the first paragraph. After that, you have the risk of losing some of your audience. So again, the headline is what people will notice. It should grab their attention and make a promise. So here's another example of that. What are we promising? This is a completely different subject. This is our convention center here in town, who do a wonderful job with experience and guest services. What are we promising here? The headline is promising an exceptional client experience, and it's a call to action. Come here and be delighted with what we offer. Okay. Number 3, emphasize your value without talking about you. We often like to joke with clients and partners that when we're developing brand positioning or issue positioning, it's really not about you. It's about the audience that you're delivering to. That's not a message that anyone ever necessarily wants to hear. But in fact, when you can emphasize your value without talking about yourself and actually talking about the audience, and to them, it is much more powerful. So those people who are veteran communicators will know this one well. Always know your audience deeply. And what you want to communicate is, how will this affect your audience and what's in it for them? Not what do you want them to know and what are the 100 things they should know about your organization, but what's in it for them to care about this issue, right? So why should I care? Here's another example from the same poverty campaign. Again, it leads with the audience and the aspiration for this audience to be involved. So it's time to change minds and hearts, because what makes a great community? You do, right? It's not focused on the issue of poverty up front. It's not focused on people living in poverty or the magnitude of the problem that people really have a hard time getting their hands around. It's saying, if we want to have a great community, we need you to contribute to that. You, the audience, not us, the cause. Okay. Number 4, be briefer than you ever thought possible. As you'll probably gather from this, even as much as I'm talking already, I have a little trouble with brevity. But being brief and cutting away the detail until you come up with that golden piece is really, really important. So when you think you're done streamlining something, there's probably still more simplicity that you can bring to something. Probably all communicators have had the experience where you come up with something really great and someone comes along and says, oh, that's awesome. Now, can we add this? Can we add that? Can we add this? And it becomes sort of a Frankenstein of its original message. So it's really important as communicators that we know that there is untapped power in simplicity. And when we can get to simplicity, it's so much easier for our audiences to engage. Here's an example of another community awareness and storytelling campaign where we told a number of stories that were clients of this particular organization, which is the London Community Health Center. And what are we trying to get across here? This is the message. Because of this organization, this young mother says, I will never be broken again. We get to the point. How strength, resilience, and a little help from a passionate health advocate kept a young mother from bankruptcy. That's the point. There are a million things we could say about this young woman, and she is extraordinary. And we do go on to say that in the storytelling campaign. But right now, what our audience needs to know to engage is this particular point. A captivating headline and something very simple to help them understand the value of the services of this organization. Here's another example of that. This is a completely different context, the unification of a couple of different organizations. But what are we trying to simply communicate? As you will know if you've been through a process like this, mergers and unifications are incredibly complex situations, and they can cause unease. Even positive change can cause unease in organizations and discomfort and culture ramifications. But boiling it right down to simply, what are we trying to communicate? We're coming together with the strength that we have as individual organizations because we want to build this unlimited potential. Again, cutting away many things we could have said about these two organizations, about what they're going to do together, coming together. But this is the point, and we need to get to it quickly in order to communicate a message to an audience that's busy. Number 5, use modern art to convey your meeting. As you probably know, most people would really rather watch a video or take a quick look at a photo or spend time on an infographic than actually read something. I would make a personal comment that I think that's a sad statement in some ways, but that's where we are. So we've got to realize that in order to fit within this new context, we need to provide graphical elements to represent what we want people to believe about our cause or issue. So this is a bit of a different example. It's an infographic actually about cybersecurity that was developed for an Ontario college. But again, just an example of how do we take something like cybersecurity and explain it in a way that non-tech people are going to understand. What is the volume and magnitude of this issue in a way that is actually somewhat digestible? because it's a pretty scary one, and there's no shortage of information on this particular topic. But what do people actually need to know, and how can we tell them in a way that doesn't make it overwhelming for them? This is an example of that. Okay, so visuals always provide clarity. Well, they typically do when they're done well, and then also convenience for the audience. Okay? They don't have to work hard to understand what you're trying to tell them. And then this point is actually related to that. We don't want our audiences working hard to try to understand our issue or to gain access to more information about it. So number 6 is reduce friction. So friction basically occurs when audiences might be interested, but there's some kind of resistance or barrier or challenge that they experience in their sort of quest to engage with your particular topic or your brand. So I really like this quote, and I'm actually not, this isn't a work sample of ours, but there's a great article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, it was last spring's edition, about sort of tongue-in-cheek, stop raising awareness already. So often when we have a cause and we want people to know about it, we do spend a lot of time raising awareness of the issue, but we don't necessarily ask people then to take an action. In a couple of weeks, when we do the second part of this webinar, I will actually talk about how you translate public awareness campaigns into public action campaigns. But it is an issue that many, in particular in the charitable and the public sector, struggle with, because there is that desire to raise awareness about important issues, but there isn't always that step. So that's an example of friction, in that if you say you run a wonderful issues-based campaign and it's highly visual and you've got your headlines down right and you've got my attention because you've done all these other steps right, and then I say, okay, you've got me, what do you want me to do now? And there isn't a call to action. It's basically, what it basically says to someone is, well, yeah, I just wanted you to be aware. Thanks so much. Thanks for your attention. But if we lose that opportunity for people to engage, or we have friction in their ability to engage, that's where we're losing a tremendous opportunity. So reducing the friction is incredibly important. So stop raising awareness and start raising action, I guess, in as much as you're able in your campaigns. So we always want to be spending time about thinking about how to make that experience easier. So when you take a journey through, say, how are people going to engage with this issue? What are we going to ask them to do? Where is that going to land them? What are the actions associated with this journey? Always spend time thinking about that from the audience perspective. So if I see an ad, or I say I click on a Facebook ad and it takes me to a website, and the website gives me more information on A, B, and C and asks me to take an action, we need to make sure that those steps are actually legitimately easy for the audience to do and reduce the friction as much as possible for them. And then the final one, number 7, is layer the detail. So this is an eating analogy. Some people want a bite, some want a snack, and a few people actually want the whole meal in terms of a communication that you may be making. So you want to order your positions in a way that allows audiences to get more substance, but at the level that they desire to have it. Sometimes when we are associated with important causes and issues, our disposition is to tell people everything about it, because if someone knew what you knew and what was in your head, they would absolutely engage with you. It would be difficult for them to turn their back on a cause or an issue if they knew the things that you knew. Unfortunately, as human beings, we don't actually have the ability to take in that much information, nor do we necessarily have the desire to take in a whole bunch of information at once. So here's an example of some things we've done to talk about the work of a municipal music office, where on the left-hand side, you see there's sort of the snack, let's say, so to speak. So what do I want to know? How much wealth is being generated by this industry in our community? This is the figure for that. Or how many people can we entertain in our music venues over a period of a year? That's the snack piece. But on the right-hand side, you see there's much more information there if you choose to dig into it. So this is the number of live shows. Excellent. That happened over a certain period, and then translating that a little bit for them, getting a little further into the narrative. So it's 4,620 live shows happened in this year. That's an average of 12 per day. That's interesting. That's getting me a little bit more, wow, the volume of this is significant in my community. And then further down, it's probably a little harder for you to see, but there's a more information on the importance of this. So a strong music industry has social, cultural, and economic benefits for all of us. So this is why we're doing this. We don't lead with the work of the music office. We lead with the impact that these live shows have in our community, or the wealth generated, or the number of people that have been able to enjoy these things. And then we earn the right to tell them more about what does that mean for our culture, what does that mean for our economy, and ultimately, how does that back up the importance of this office within this community. We don't lead with the office. It's not about the office. It's about their impact and their outcome. So we order the information in order for people to get what they need and choose to go a little deeper. So the faster and obviously more emotionally your audience can get what you're talking about, the more likely they are to take action on something, right? If you bombard people with information, at a certain point, they're not going to be able to take any more in, let alone be able to actually engage with you in a meaningful way. Okay, moving on. So now we're going to talk about getting prepared. So planning to plan, which sounds probably kind of silly. And certainly for those of you who are busy, you probably see that and think, I don't have time to plan. I barely have time to do the planning itself. But I would argue that there are a few steps that you need to take, or you're going to fall into what we affectionately refer to around here at Sagecomm as the sort of famous 5. So sometimes what happens when we say, well, we don't have time to write a plan, we just have to get to it because this issue is so important, we need to just get after it and get going on this. Because often planning and research can be seen as things that are expensive and also time consuming. But here are some of the, I don't want to say traps, but challenges that we see some clients and partners falling into without a plan. So you start with quote unquote us instead of them, which means starting out talking about your organization rather than talking about the audience or to the audience themselves. So that's a sure way to turn the audience off, by talking about yourself first. Number 2, you start with 200 things instead of 2. As I mentioned earlier, our disposition as humans when we're passionate about something is to tell someone everything about our cause or issue, because if we do that, then they're going to understand why they should be involved, and we'll have them for life. But as human beings, we don't have the ability to hear 200 things. We might have the ability to hear, 2, maybe 3 things. But if we start without a plan and without a position, that's a trap we're going to fall into. Number 3, starting with someone else's story. So literally adopting, someone else is doing something interesting in a related sector, let's just grab that. And that'll probably work for us if we adapt it. And that's often also desirable from a financial perspective. When you can adopt what someone else has done, you can find some efficiencies and you don't have to pay for it. It's yourself. But what that often means is if you haven't looked at your community, looked at it carefully, what does your community look like? What does the audience need? You're going to be starting with someone else's story and not your own. Number 4, starting with tactic envy. I can't take a poll here, but if those of you on the phone, if you think about how many times you've had someone come over to your desk or come into your office and say, hey, cause X or brand X, so-and-so has this wonderful new whatever, new ad campaign, new set of print materials, whatever that shiny new thing, it has a new television commercial, whatever that shiny new thing is. And then it's easy to, and they say, we should have one of those too. Well, it's easy to fall into sort of tactic envy, right? That reacting to if the competition, and even though we're maybe in the charitable or public sector, there is sort of non-traditional competition for funds and attention. Starting with someone else's tactic is not necessarily going to get you the results you want, even though it's seductive sort of to want to say, oh yeah, we should make one of those too, because that looks great. It doesn't necessarily steward what you need to be effective in your work. And then finally, starting with what or how versus why. For some reason, as humans, we've been trained to talk more about programs and services and statistics and those types of things, rather than talking about our why. Why does this thing exist, and why should anyone care? And certainly that's a lot based around the work of Simon Sinek, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the book Start With Why, but it's a great read if you haven't had an opportunity to read it. And he talks extensively about how as human beings, we have the ability to really understand the why more than we care about or want to interact with the what and how. If we get the why right, we earn the right to talk about the what and how to our potential volunteers, donors, etc. So 3 must-dos for planning: stakeholder engagement, audience and market research, and issue positioning. And I'm going to spend the rest of my sort of 10, 12 minutes here talking about these 3 things. So I would say without these things, there is no plan. I would say you can't write a plan without them. I really believe firmly that you need a plan. So these are necessary steps to move forward. So stakeholder engagement is one of the most important steps, and it's one that's often skipped. When I say stakeholders, I'm not talking about your external audience. I'm talking about your peers inside your organization and also inside your sector or your movement. Right? So why would you do this? The answer is you need your campaigns or your communication plans to be sustainable. So campaigns that have a chance of making a dent in the universe, that we like to call that, or the ones that really make impact, are either well-funded or they're well-supported. I'm going to take a wild guess here, just based on all the work we do in charitable, nonprofit, and public sectors, that you're not teeming with resources, bags of money sitting around to do communication and awareness. So in the absence of those funds, community support and momentum are really the only ways to make that dent in the universe and to sustain a campaign that you have invested in. So your sector peers and your folks inside your organization, even if they don't work directly in marketing or communications or community engagement, are your number one audience. And I think sometimes, and I'll say this, having worked also personally in other roles in the charitable sector, that sometimes the sectors can feel a little bit competitive, right? And there might be a little bit of, we're collaborative, but we also know that we're competing in a limited pool of donors or volunteers or those types of things, which can cause us, without any malice and no fault of our own, to maybe not be as collaborative as we need to be. I know that both Trillium and Tamarack are focused on collective impact, and that's a wonderful focus. There's a lot of that work done here in London by the London Child and Youth Network as well. But just still, every once in a while, sometimes it feels challenging to engage peers in this way. And what I mean by engaging them is more than, do you like what we made? When the campaign is ready to be launched and you say, look at this, or the plan is ready to be rolled out, and you say, hey, look what we made, we're wondering what you think of it. But at that point, it's more of a motherhood exercise. You're already done and you're ready to go. True engagement from our perspective, and we've had good success working with organizations and causes of all sizes in engaging groups, is get a community working group. That would be people from all levels of your partner organizations, including frontline and mid-level supervisory. So not just necessarily your leaders in organizations, because they don't have a ton of time to give, and you need some time from a working group, but also that you get the people who are directly delivering service and understand the issue in a potentially different and unique way. And we've also had great success as well with engaging lived experience consultants. I won't take credit for that. I would give credit to clients for bringing people to the table who can be lived experience consultants, as in, say, people with lived experience in poverty, for example, but have had some great experiences in that vein, because they can truly give you the real perspective, straight from, not assumptions, but the real perspective from people who have experienced it. And they can also tell you when you're barking up the wrong tree. When you think you've got a brilliant idea and you think the sector or the issue is really going to benefit from something, having people at the table who can tell you, you missed this time, we have to go back to the drawing board, is just as important as having a well-funded campaign. And then, so I say this not, trying to promote certainly businesses like mine, but it often will help to have an objective third-party facilitator who doesn't have an affiliation to your cause or sector. It doesn't have a particular agenda to drive forward. I mean, we all have agendas. They're often benevolent, and probably everyone I'm speaking to right now has a real passion towards the benevolent cause that they're working on. But nonetheless, we all have different agendas that can compete when we bring a sector working group together. So that's just a thought for consideration. If you are able to do it, it can be really helpful to have a third party assisting you with those conversations. So what you would ask this working group to help you define is really, what does this movement truly need? What audiences help us advance whatever ambitious goal we have set together in number one that our movement needs? And what do we need to know from the audiences that we have to really connect with them, that true audience engagement, really understanding them. So great benefit in a community, in working group if you can do it. Next step, knowing your audience. I've said this a few times. It's not about them. It's about them, not about you. No one likes to hear that. But from a positioning and audience engagement perspective, we've got to talk to the audience first and earn the right to tell them something about ourselves. So true audience understanding comes from being open to your assumptions potentially being wrong. Which none of us want to hear. But there really is something to the what we would call the bubble factor or the bubble effect, where you can be so deeply ingrained in a cause or an issue or a brand, it's easy to believe that everybody either knows what you know or believes what you believe and wants to help you solve things. So some questions: who are our audience's people? What do they care about? What are their needs and desires? What are their pain points and perceptions? How can you reduce friction for them in understanding this particular issue? And then audience understanding really does come from research. That can be surveys, focus groups, simulated exercises. You really want to probe feelings and perceptions about the issues or brands that you want to connect with and really truly understand what they know and what they feel. So we don't want to understand necessarily how well aligned they are to what you already believe, but really know what they feel about something. It helps you get away from your own biases. So you don't want to pick those participants who already believe what you believe. And don't use your research to try to make your audience believe that thing. And this is your opportunity to really get what they get and what they don't get. If you can immerse them in an issue with a challenge, so poverty simulation would be an example. It's a great way to understand, again, what your audience gets and what they don't get and what they are able to understand. And ask them a million questions. Ask them as many questions as they will tolerate if you're able. And I say this as being important because I can tell you specifically about an example that we had. We're working on a poverty awareness campaign, and our team here really believed that we could make our audience have an emotional breakthrough. If we put them through simulations of poverty, middle-class audience, they would really get this thing and have these emotional breakthroughs, and we would capture them and be this beautiful, wonderful thing. Well, in fact, the opposite of that happened. What happened was we discovered that our audience, actually, the audience we were trying to target really couldn't understand what it was like to have an experience of poverty because they hadn't. And it really helped us define what the message for the campaign would be, getting to what they could understand, and then earning the right to tell them more. But had we taken that initial idea without research, that campaign would have been considerably less effective than it was, because we would be working on assumptions, informed nonetheless, but still assumptions. So I would say if you propose a research and positioning exercise, you're going to get pushback on that. You're going to say it's going to take too long, it's going to be too time consuming, it's too expensive, we don't have time to do this. We've got to solve this issue now. We need more people with us now. But in the example that I just gave you with the poverty simulations, really in the position you're in, you cannot afford to waste time or waste money on a campaign that doesn't work. So if you thought that research and audience engagement would be a valuable tool for you in a communication plan that you're writing, this would be a good way to support that. Our organization can't afford to waste our time or money. And this is how we're going to make sure that we don't. And then the final step, just really quickly, and I'm going to talk about this more in 2 weeks, a lot of focus on positioning in the sort of 2.0 webinar that we're doing on April 11th, is how you translate that research into a story. So taking all of those principles that we discussed, those 7 steps, how to make a really great communication, all of those things would form your position. So when we say position, it's kind of marketing jargon. A great position represents what you ultimately want your audience to believe. Right? If you could wave a magic wand today, what would they believe about your cause or issue or brand that's going to cause them to engage with you and engage in a sustainable way, or to share your story? So positions that can spread, that people really relate to and want to share on your behalf, are the ones that win. So they are audience focused, they're emotional, they're remarkable, and they're true. True, real, and authentic. And they also focus on the why. So not what is this thing, but why should I care about it? What is the potential outcome if we were to solve this together and I were to get engaged as part of that? So I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a couple of weeks, but that is the outcome of doing your stakeholder engagement, doing your market research, really knowing your audience deeply, and then being able to develop a position that looks like this: emotional, remarkable, true, and highly shareable. So a couple of final thoughts for your consideration, then we'll wrap up for questions. Take the time, if you can, to engage your peers in these processes when you're preparing to plan. Truly understand your audience, engage people as you can with lived experience if that's possible. Realize it's not about you, even though, the inherent me factor, everything we want to be about ourselves as individuals, but really it's about that audience focus and what they can hear from you, not necessarily what you want to tell them. You want to focus on the outcome when you're developing that piece, not on the cause or the agency, but what do we need to do in research so that we can develop a position that focuses on our outcome and get people to buy into that. And then we sort of have this joke here that we need to defend the audience. So we need to talk to them about themselves and their interests and their needs and their pain points first, and then we earn the right to tell them more. Okay, and that is the 42-minute whirlwind tour of preparing to plan. I'll stop here and turn it back over to Duncan for any questions.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. As Lindsay mentioned, we now have the opportunity to open up the floor, and you can ask Lindsay any specific questions that you have. As a reminder, if you've joined us online, you can write your questions in the question box at the bottom of the control panel, or you can tweet your questions using the hashtag #TamarackConnects. Why don't we start with a question from Erica. How do you tailor your message if you have many audiences, each with different needs or understandings of the issue at hand?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm glad that you asked it, Erica, because I know often, particularly if you're working in communications, if you ask who's the audience for this, sometimes people will say, well, everybody. Or the audience is the general public, which isn't really an audience at all because it's not a homogeneous audience. And it can be a challenge, I think, to explain that to folks because we do want to get our communication to go as far and wide as possible. The way that we approach that is to do the research and get that core position so that, again, what is that ultimate thing that we want people, if we could wave a magic wand, what would people believe about this issue? And from that position, we would niche key messages for a couple of key audiences. So you would define, for example, 2 to 3 primary audiences, say, that would be the max, I would say, and then a couple of secondary audiences that will get your message through the benefit of this campaign being delivered to your primary audiences. They're important, but not as important as that primary. And then you would really focus in on those 1 or 2 things that particular audience, those primary audiences can hear. And when I say can hear, that's the kind of thing that the research will tell you. For example, if I'm trying to target mothers between the ages of 29 and 45, and I try to target them by showing them something really shocking or disturbing related to a child issue that I'm stewarding. Our research tells us that kind of thing actually shuts people down emotionally, in particular mothers as it relates to their children. So niching our message in that way would not be effective at all for that audience. But we wouldn't have known that unless we took the time to do the research. The other thing that your research allows you to do is really pinpoint those key audiences carefully, so you have a leg to stand on. If you have to go back to decision makers or leaders and say, I know we want to have the general public as our audience, but in order to make the greatest impact with the dollars that we have and to maximize the influence that we can have in this issue, we know if we use these 3 audiences and tell them these 3 things, our research tells us we're going to do a better job than blanketing the entire community with a message that only, a very small fraction of them can hear.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from Lori. Any tips on choosing what types of messages suit a specific type of media? In other words, like a snack versus a full meal.
For sure. Well, definitely particular mediums. Some of them are even, they almost prescribe. If you take social media, for example, they almost prescribe the length of things. If you want to do publish ads, for example, on Facebook or Instagram, percentage of text and that kind of thing. we like to say as much information as it takes to get the job done, but not more. And what you're really trying to do for the most part when you're engaged in a public awareness and action campaign, what you're trying to do is get people to take essentially one more step towards you. It may not be a physical step, but you're getting them to agree for you to tell them one more thing. So with, let's take, for example, a Facebook ad campaign or a Facebook organic content campaign. You couldn't possibly hope to explain a complex issue in a Facebook ad or a Facebook post. And if you're trying to, it's probably not going to be effective. But what you can do in a medium like that is to say, let's give them enough of a headline and a nugget of information that relates to them and what they believe that they will click. If we can get them to click to subscribe to a newsletter list, or to go to a website, or to agree to like a page, or those types of things, then essentially in that component of your comms campaign has won for you. If you can get that person to take an action, what you don't want to do is try to make a medium do too many things. So for example, billboards can't do much for you except make one impression, which is awareness. For the most part, they can't cause people to learn something. And they may not even be able to cause people to visit a site, because in a billboard situation where you're driving by, it's really just an impression to reinforce a message. So in that case, I guess I would say in any context, whether you're talking about social media or traditional advertising, don't try to make your medium do too many things. Try to make it just either make that one really good, powerful impression, or get the person to take that one single step you want them to take towards you. And for the most part, that's just, sure, you can tell me I'll click and you can tell me one more thing. That's a win for any type of mass media, whether it's digital or traditional. And we're able so much less so to control what's in the newspaper. That used to be once upon a time when you had great media partnerships, the ability to deliver a detailed message through the media, but those opportunities aren't there. They're very few and far between now. So I would just say, as simple as possible, as little possible information as you can to get the job done and get people to take one more step towards you and your cause.
Thank you for that. We've had a couple questions about a book you mentioned. Some people just wanted you to repeat the name of that book.
Sure, it was Simon Sinek, last name Sinek, and the title of the book is Start With Why. He's also got a really good TEDx talk. Actually, I think it was his TEDx talk that sort of catapulted him to first internet fame, and now he's an author of a number of different books on mostly on culture and leadership. But his research into why and how people are motivated is really, really interesting. So it's a quick read, but if you don't have time for the full book, the TED Talk's about 19 minutes, and it's really worth a watch.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Next question here. You mentioned bringing in people with lived experience as a key part of the research process. Can you speak to any situations when you've had to restore trust in order to establish that type of relationship?
Oh, that's a really good, that's an excellent question. Well, I'm going to start off by giving credit to our friends and partners at the City of London for this concept of engaging people with lived experience, because it was really them that brought that forward, and we've benefited from it in a number of campaigns. I think it's, I don't know if I can speak particularly to a situation where trust needs to be rebuilt, but I can tell you, generally, in establishing a relationship in a diverse group like that can be a really interesting challenge. It's a really interesting exercise in self-awareness and also, I think, empathy, because it's really interesting when you put a group of people together who are on a working group who may be diverse in background or experience to a certain point. We're often talking about generally middle-class professionals, whether they're working in communications and social work and community development. In that way, it tends to be a fairly homogeneous group. And bringing in people with lived experience really, I think, made our entire group hyper aware of the assumptions that we make, the language that we use, and generally the way that we approach things. So really understanding, not making it a sort of a token, please sit at our table and rubber stamp our process, which really could lead to a breakdown in trust. It was a lot of work in really understanding the lived experience consultants, who they were, where they were coming from, and a lot of back and forth on, really interesting back and forth on what we knew would be effective for the audience versus what they felt did the cause justice and did their experience justice, and wasn't sensationalizing or exploiting the experience in some way. And I think sometimes that's potentially where these kinds of relationships have danger of breaking down when we're not aware of our own biases and assumptions, even going into a process with the best possible intentions. And we sometimes in our business, you'll pardon the expression, I hope we refer to that as issue porn, where we try to make something as gritty and sensational as possible, which causes a bit of a voyeuristic almost reaction in the audience, where they do want to see behind the curtain for that sensational, gritty, what's going on in that situation. But one, it is exploitive to the people who you are ultimately trying to help. But second, we also know that does cause people that emotional piece. I want to see what goes on there, but it doesn't cause me to take an action. It causes me to either shut down emotionally or to make a judgment. So that's what I would say. Again, not specifically rebuilding trust, but the exercise of building trust is a lot about audience understanding within your particular working group before you even get started.
Oh, thanks for that insight. I just have a final quick question. This is from Fenella, just asking whether the audience, you mentioned doing research with an audience, they want to confirm whether or not that's the stakeholder audience that you were describing earlier, or if the research is done with a broader audience.
Yes, with a broader audience. So you might do some initial, typically how we would handle it is if you are able to strike a really great diverse working group from the community and with people with lived experience, then you do an initial discovery with them and understand as much as you can everything they know about this issue, including what their perceptions and biases are. And that goes both for your lived experience folks and also for your sector working group members. So there is a discovery phase there, but then the research that we are talking about is really more focused on the core audience. So we said, say for a particular campaign, we said, I'll pick on mom again because that's an audience that most people want to get at because she's a purchase decision maker and she's an influencer in her own social networks and in her family. If you know you want to reach parents, say, but mom as the influencer, then you would actually go out into the community and solicit participation by people in those audiences in your research process. And you would be surprised how many people, even though we're all busy, are very willing to contribute their time to be involved in something. So we took five middle-class families through simulations of poverty a couple of years ago, and they're all busy professionals, and they were very willing to take part in that research because they knew they wanted to understand the issue better and weren't able to where they were in their lives at that particular moment. And that was extraordinarily valuable. And you can do that in all kinds of ways. Simulations, focus groups to some extent, though focus groups have a little problematic in kind of groupthink and pleasing behavior, but even surveying, understanding what people's perceptions are right off the hop of a particular issue before you go deeper into audience immersion of some kind. So it is that external audience and trying to get people to participate that aren't people you know, if you can do it. So drawing on the network of everyone on your sector working group to bring people to the table who are going to be appropriate and aren't going to tell you what they think you want to hear because they know you and they know you're passionate about the issue.
Thank you for that. And with that answer, I think we've made it to time here. So I just wanted to thank you again, Lindsay, for your presentation. And many thanks to all for joining us in the audience. Your comments and questions have really helped make this more of an engaging discussion. And as promised, in a few days, we'll email you with a recording of this webinar along with other material related to today's call. We also have some incredible learning opportunities that are just around the corner that I'd love to share with you. We'll be holding a workshop on authentic engagement in St. Catharines, Ontario by our very own Sylvia Choi. Sylvia will be discussing the authentic engagement of citizen leaders, delving into how to nurture these relationships and why it's a strategy that a growing number of organizations and municipalities are embracing. In May, we're hosting a new Adaptive Leadership Masterclass series that will be led by experts Liz Skelton and Tamarack's own Liz Weaver. These one-day events will take place in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa beginning May 23rd. So we encourage you to follow the link on your screen if that perks your interest as well. Registration links for these events will be shared in the email you receive after today's webinar, along with links to sign up for the next installment of this Diving Deeper webinar series. To learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, please visit www.tamarackcommunity.ca. And we also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to complete feedback on how you enjoyed today's call. The link on your screen will be sent to you with your email as well. Thanks again, Lindsay, and everyone else, and we hope you have a wonderful day.